I wrote first son. I have to confirm that, but I think it's his oldest son. Gets married to Tamar, and the son dies. The second son then marries Tamar. The second son dies. The expectation was that the third son would marry Tamar, but Judah says, you know what? He's too young. When he gets old enough, then I'll let him marry you. So Tamar goes back home. She's waiting for her, third time's a charm. And the youngest son gets old enough, and she doesn't get the call. And she's thinking to herself, I've been cheated. So then she hears Judah's coming to town. So she dresses up. The wording isn't completely clear exactly, but basically the image is that she dresses up as somebody who's a harlot, a prostitute, stands at the city gate. Judah comes by, and he says, how about I share a couple of my sheep or goats or whatever it is in exchange for a night. She says, okay. They sleep together, and so he didn't actually have these goats or sheep, so whatever it was that he offered. So he said, I'll give you collateral. I'll give you my signature ring, my stick, a couple of things, so that you know that I'll pay you. So then he sends his servant a little while later to pay her. And he asks around, he says, where is this harlot? Where's this prostitute that hangs out at the gate? And he said, I'm sorry, we don't do this kind of thing around here. There is none. So he figures, all right, I got away with it. Then a little while later, he hears that Tamar is pregnant. And now Judah seems to get all self-righteous. And he says, how dare she? And she has to be killed. She has to be burned. So, which is another question, which is on what basis, right? So they bring her, and she says, do what you got to do. But before you do, I have one question. Who did these things belong to? And she shows his ring, and she shows his stick. And Judah realizes that it's his. And he says, you're more righteous than I am. She conceives, and she has two sons, Peretz and Zerach. Right? That's the end of the story in our parsha. Later on, we'll see that King David and ultimately the Jewish redemption is tied into this story because the Messiah, whatever that means, is supposed to come from King David, and King David comes from Peretz, who was the product of this union of Tamar and her father-in-law Judah. All right. So later on, you'll see in the fifth book of the Torah, Dvarim, Deuteronomy, it says that it explicitly lays out this mitzvah that if someone dies without having a son, then the person who died's brother is supposed to marry the widow, and the first son born through that union kind of applies to the deceased brother, and we'll see what that means as well. All right, so let's look at the sources, and then we'll get more into it. Any questions before we start? All right, original sources in the Tanakh. For those that are not familiar or don't remember that term, that means Torah, Nevi'im, Uktuvim. So when we say the Hebrew Bible, we're not just talking about the first 5 books of Moses. We're also talking about a whole bunch of other books, known as the prophets and the writings, like the book of Isaiah, the book of Kings, the book of Psalms, and a whole bunch of other ones that are considered part of the Hebrew Bible. In Christianity, known as the Old Testament, although it's a little bit tricky about which books are included and which aren't, as you'll see later. All right. So sources in Tanakh for the mitzvah of Yibum, that's the Hebrew word for this mitzvah. In English, it's called levirate marriage. The word levirate comes from the the Latin word levir, which means the brother of the deceased or something like that. The obligation or allowance of marrying the widow of one's brother if he did not have sons. So the first one is from this week's Parsha. If anybody has any questions or just wants clarifications, just jump in. So we're in the book of Genesis. Then Judah said to Onan, join with your brother's wife and do your duty by her as a brother-in-law and provide offspring for your brother. But Onan, knowing that the seed would not count as his, let it go to waste whenever he joined with his brother's wife, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. This is also where the rabbis based the prohibition of masturbation on, even though it doesn't actually say that explicitly. But they take it as implied that it's wrong. But that's a whole other story. Generally the main source for this mitzvah, where it's spelled out, is in the book of Deuteronomy, Dvar. And this is what it says. When brothers dwell together and one of them dies and leaves no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Right? So it seems pretty clear here that it's not just, based on this language, it's not just an allowance, but it's an obligation. She can't be married to anybody else. Her husband's brother shall unite with her. He shall take her as his wife and perform the levir's duty. And again, the levir is the brother-in-law of the deceased. The first son that she bears shall be accounted to the dead brother. And the rationale that's given, what's the point of this whole ritual? That his name may not be blotted out in Israel. And again, what exactly that means is not entirely clear, although it's, you can kind of get the general idea. But if the man does not want to marry his brother's widow shall appear before the elders in the gate and declare, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name in Israel for his brother. He will not perform the duty of a levir. The elders of his town shall then summon him and talk to him. If he insists, saying, I don't want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull the sandal off his foot, spit in his face. Let me repeat that. Spit in his face. You will not see that anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible where you're literally being told to spit in somebody's face. And make this declaration. Thus shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And he shall go in Israel by the name of the family of the unsandaled one. Right? So clearly, based on what we're reading here, this is what I would call a shaming ritual. Everything okay?
Yeah, my line going to farm market.
Okay, have fun. All right. So that's the source. That's the main source for this mitzvah. Is there any ambiguity here? Does it seem like there's any ambiguity about this?
No.
Right? All right. So,
Rabbi, does she have to marry him? Does he have to marry her anyway after that ritual?
he does not. He does not. That's his way out. All right, and that ritual is called chalitza, and we'll talk more about it as well. So the next story that we have,
Rabbi?
yeah, go ahead.
Maybe a stupid question. What if the only other brother is married and has a family?
It's a very good question, and the only stupid question is the question not asked.
Okay.
All right, so you have to put this in the context that polygamy was allowed, right? And so I think there is almost an assumption that he has another wife and that this is an add-on wife, but it doesn't say that. And that becomes complicated because polygamy was expressly forbidden earlier, much earlier than yibum, than levirate marriage was prohibited. All right, story of Ruth. So the story of Ruth kind of deals with this, although it isn't an exact case, right? And we've talked about this on the holiday of Shavuot when we read the book of Ruth. Vayomer Boaz continued, and this is the middle of a story. I'm not going to go into the whole story because otherwise it'll take up too much time. But the crux of the story is that there was, the beginning is similar, where there was one who died, and then there were other children. Were there other children? I'm getting all confused. Basically, this is a widow, and her husband dies, and her mother-in-law tells her, "All right, go back to your people. I don't have anyone for you to marry." And she says, "No, I don't want to go. I want to stay with you. Your people are my people. Where you go, I'll go." And then later on in the story, she's married off to a relative of her husband, not a brother, right? So that's where it's not quite the same as the original story. And this is the quote there: "When you acquire the property from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabite, you must also acquire the wife of the deceased." So this is talking about some relative of the deceased, of the widow's husband, who they go to before marrying her off to somebody else. They say, "You have the right to marry her because of this levirate marriage thing. Do you want to marry her? But if you do, you also have to buy this this property." And the guy's like, I really don't need this. Keep her." And the other guy gets married to her. But in that story, it also gives that same reason, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate. Over here, it doesn't just say perpetuate the name; it also says upon his estate. And so over here, it's clearly tied to property. It's not just, as I would see it, as legacy. Now we're also talking about money and property. The mitzvah of yibum is an exception to the prohibition of marrying one's sister-in-law, right? Because there is an explicit prohibition that says in Leviticus, "Do not marry a woman as a rival to her sister and uncover her nakedness in the other's lifetime." I think I brought the wrong verse. Yeah, I clearly brought the wrong verse in. I need to edit that. But a verse right next to it says, "Don't marry your sister-in-law." So because of this need of perpetuating someone's name or whatever property attachments are involved, this mitzvah was so important that it overrides one of the prohibitions of marriage that are are presented as abominations and all of that. The reason for the mitzvah is given as that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. So what does this mean? does it mean that the first son is literally given the same name as the deceased brother?
No,
Who says no?
I do.
All right.
I
Rona.
don't, I think the
I
main
do too.
issue, I'm
Okay.
sorry, I think the main issue is maintaining the tribe and people in the tribe. And if you don't perpetuate the dead brother's legacy, then the tribe gets smaller. And then what do you have left of your tribe?
Okay.
No,
You're not off base.
this is Shelley.
Yeah.
I disagree a bit. I think there is something about perpetuating that particular person's name, but it doesn't. It would be named, say, Shmuel Ben, and the brother's name. That would perpetuate his name. He doesn't have to literally be given the brother's name.
Right. Right. So that would seem to make more sense. But you're not necessarily disagreeing with Paula about the reason. You're just saying in terms of no, that you wouldn't give him the same exact name.
Correct.
Yeah. And for Ashkenazim, it's like, yeah, well, that would be weird anyway. But for Sfardim, they're a little more flexible with these things. So way back when. So there's actually a discussion of the Talmud, as well as some of the commentators, about this exact thing, which we'll touch on shortly. And there is a suggestion that this son be given the name. And I didn't see a suggestion, the one that would make more sense, which would be, he would be, that person, Ben, the name of the deceased. Which if we're saying that this is really what it means, then that's what it should say. All right, next option, and these are just some options that I saw and thought of, but I'm certainly open to suggestion. Another perspective is that it is about the mitzvah to have children, right? So if we think of the ledger, if we think of, the image of Nasana Tokef, God sitting up there and tallying our mitzvot and not, well, it's an important mitzvah to have children, and if this person goes to heaven without a child, it's like, oh, you don't get whatever amount of points that one was worth, if you will. However, if his brother marries his widow and has a son, and again, the son versus the daughter part is tricky, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well, then he gets the merit for that. So is that what we're talking about? Right? Which implies this whole afterlife and, thing happening in heaven. Okay, next. A third perspective relates to inheritance and property, as we already mentioned. A clue for this comes from where it says, when brothers dwell together. Right? Why should it say dwell together? What does that have to do with anything? If this is only about the name, then they can live on the other side of the world. The legacy is the legacy. But by saying dwell together, it kind of hints at that they're living together on a property. Which can be interpreted literally or more broadly. Some interpret it as more broadly. They dwelled in the same house, earlier or whatever. This can be seen, as well as it can be seen on an individual level or on a tribal level, which is what Paula was talking about keeping either what Paula suggested in terms of literally keeping the numbers up of the people in the tribe, or keeping the property of the tribe. Right? At some point, every time you lose land, your actual area of the tribe gets smaller. Yet another perspective is that it's really about protections for the widow. And the parentheses is my own. But it was presented as benefiting the deceased male as it would be more palpable in a patriarchal society. Right? Because it's clearly, the way it's presented is that it's for the male's name. It's not to protect the widow. I was reading an interesting paper about Yoruba culture, and if anybody wants to look at that comparison, you can follow this link. I'll just show it briefly. Levirate marriage among the Hebrews and widows' inheritance among the Yoruba, comparative investigation. This is somebody who was studying it and looking at what happened in Nigeria when the Christian missionaries came, and there were protections for widows embedded in the system. And when they came and they said, this is not barbaric, but primitive, you guys marrying your sisters-in-law, we don't do that. There was no replacement for protections for the widow that system had. And all of a sudden you had all these widows who were penniless, and it perpetuated a whole bunch of other problems. And so he's advocating for bringing it back in Nigeria. I didn't get through the whole thing. He may also propose that maybe finding other solutions of taking care of the widow, which would be nice. This explanation falls apart when there are multiple widows, right? And this goes back to what Lenora said about polygamy. Since the Yibum only applies to one of them. All right, you don't have to marry all of them and then the firstborn son gets it. So if this was really about protecting the widow, I mean, I suppose one is better than none. And there's a fascinating case that's talked about in the New Testament, a debate between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. We also have it in the Apocrypha, which we've talked about a little bit and is especially pertinent to Hanukkah. The Apocrypha are books that were written around the same time as some of these other books that were included into the Hebrew Bible, but were chosen not to be included. So there's a book of Tobit, which I bring a quote from later, which also gives the same example that they debate about, which is a woman who ends up marrying seven brothers, yeah. So this family has taken the Levirate marriage to a whole other level.
Oh my
Right?
goodness.
Go ahead, Paul. Were you gonna ask something?
No, I just said, oh my goodness.
Yeah, exactly. So then, as you may have heard, one of the debates was around around the time of the beginning of Christianity. One of the debates within Judaism was how much does the idea of the soul, the afterlife, the resurrection, all of these things, how Jewish are they? Right? You look at the 5 books, there's no mention of resurrection. Even the idea of a soul, nefesh, it's not really explicitly fleshed out, if you will. You have some cases in later books, but again, it's really vague. And so some said this is all a later invention by the rabbis, and Judaism is all about this world, maybe some reward and punishment, but for the most part, certainly no reincarnation or resurrection, all of that. Others, the Pharisees, who modern rabbinic Judaism comes from, argued that that does exist, and it's an important part of things. So to challenge them, they said, okay, so you say there's going to be resurrection. So when resurrection happens, which one of these brothers ends up with this widow? right? And they presented this to Jesus, and it's a whole thing. It's fascinating. But the point, without going into that story, too much, is that this is another reference to this, that it was clearly important enough that it became a major debate point. It was one of the issues that came up around that time, where there was a lot of contention about Judaism in general. All right. So text from the Talmud discussing if it means literal name or inheritance, right? Which we talked about before. So this is from the Talmud, Yivamot. Yivamot is plural for the word Yibum, which is the subject at hand. The mitzvah of Yibum is the mitzvah that we're talking about. So the Gemara says, the sages taught the following interpretation of the verse, and it shall be that the firstborn, right? And when quoting the Gemara, anything that's in bold is the actual translation of the Talmud. This is from the Steinsaltz Talmud. So anything that's in bold is actual translation. The words that are not in bold are put in to help give it context. So in the quote, it says, and it shall be, the quote from Deuteronomy that talks about this mitzvah, it says, and it shall be that the firstborn that she bears, the widow bears, shall be established in the name of his dead brother, and his name will not be blotted out of Israel. From here, the sages derive that the mitzvah to consummate the levirate marriage is upon the eldest, because it says the firstborn. All right. The next phrase, that she bears, is interpreted to exclude levirate marriage in the case of a widow who is an Ailonit, who cannot bear children. And it continues from the next phrase, shall be established in the name of his dead brother. It is derived that the same brother who performs the mitzvah of levirate marriage is established in his brother's name. His brother's name with regard to inheritance. Right, so over here it's suggesting that it's about inheritance. It's not exactly clear how it comes to that from these words. Shall be established in the name of his dead brother. How that interprets to inheritance seems like a little bit of a stretch. Oh, here he goes, i.e. he inherits his brother's property. Yeah, it still doesn't really. Okay. The Brisa continues and asks, do you say that he succeeds in the name of his brother for inheritance, or perhaps it is only to inherit his name? If, e.g., the deceased brother was named Yosef, they must call the son born to the levirate marriage Yosef. Or if his name was Yochanan, then they must call him Yochanan. The Brisa answers, it is stated here, he shall succeed in the name of his brother, and it is stated there, they shall be called after the name of their brothers in their inheritance. Just as there, I'm not sure exactly where there is, just as the word name stated there in Genesis referring explicitly to inheritance, so to the word name stated here in Leviticus means with regard to inheritance. So this is a really fascinating way of logic, basically, which says that when you have either the exact same word in two places, or you have a similar phrase or something like that, the rules that apply to one apply to the other. It's one that I've always struggled with because it seems like a pretty weak argument. When it's a really obscure word or really obscure phrase, okay, I could see, that they may be talking about the same thing. But when you're talking about the word name, it says name thousands of times. If that's the word that we're going to go on.
Rabbi Shelley.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I understand it correctly, you can't make Gzera Shava out of anything.
Right.
That just because it says name and name, you can't make there has to be something from Moshe on
Exactly.
Sinai. So it's not exactly logical.
Right. so the explanation that's given to help this make more sense is that really this is all stuff that we learned from Moses on Sinai. However, we're also trying to make a connection within the text, right? So if you tell me that Moses told it to you, and I think you're a trustworthy guy, I can't argue with you. If you're some random person who just came out of Bellevue Psych Ward and you start telling me Moses, told you on Sinai, I'm going to say, bring me some more proof. Anyway, okay. All right, so Rashi on Dvarim, he shall succeed in the name of his brother. He who has married his deceased brother's wife shall receive the portion of the dead brother in his father's property. And Rashi is basing it on the Sifri. So, but Rashi seems to indicate that this is not literally giving this son, taking on his what would have been his father's name, but this is all about property. Based on this Rashi, it seems the mitzvah is about inheritance. However, if it was only about inheritance, wouldn't it make more sense to limit the mitzvah of Yibum to only cases when the deceased had no children at all? Why? Didn't the rules of inheritance change to include daughters when there were no sons after the daughters of Tzalacha protest? Does anybody want to tell that story? We've talked about it a couple of times. Is that ringing a bell?
Isn't that where they were going into Israel and they did not have any inheritance and they asked to be of equal inheritance to the brothers?
Kind of.
Right.
It was, I think, it was a case where a father died and he had only daughters, and
Correct.
they came to Moses and said, it's not right that this property not come to us, and Moses allowed the inheritance to go to the daughters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things that's so fascinating about this story and the feminists have really kind of grabbed onto is that it's a very rare case where within the Torah the rules change because somebody protested and said, hey, that's not fair. Right. And the fascinating part of it is that happened, and yet when we're reading the laws of the levirate marriage, there's no mention of it. It keeps talking about the son, right? And so if one believes that the Torah was kind of written either by different people or different pieces at different times, then the simple explanation is that this mitzvah and these sections were written out before that event happened, and had it been written after, well, then it would have been written differently. But it's just fascinating to think about. I found this in the Jewish Encyclopedia as I was researching for this class, which I thought was pretty interesting. This was written by Solomon Schechter. It would appear that Solomon Schechter and somebody else. It would appear that later, the levirate marriage came to be regarded as obligatory only when the widow had no children of either sex. The Septuagint. What was that, Paul?
No.
Yeah, the Septuagint, which is the famous translation into Greek of 70 or 80, I think 80, right? 70 rabbis. It's a fascinating story in itself of how this came about, where they were each put into a separate room, not told why they were being put there, and then told, translate the Torah into Greek. And they're like, okay, we can't collaborate. And the way the story goes is they all came up with the same translation. Particularly interesting is the first word of the Torah, Bereshit, where the syntax, the way they put it was a little bit differently to make sure that it doesn't come out as if there was some god named Bereshit who created the world. But again, that whole story can be a class of its own. But in that translation, when it says Ben usually translates as son, but over there it translates to child. And the Sadducees, who we just talked about before, which was the group of the Jews that were kind of the Kohanim, the ones who were the more literalist, and the ones who rejected reincarnation and resurrection and all of that. They also, and the Sadducees in the New Testament take it in this way, in this sense. So my assumption is that they were doing that based on the Slavchut story, but it doesn't say that explicitly. And you can also see Josephus for that. Anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, and we're running out of time. This is the story of Slavchut, which I already mentioned, so we'll skip that. But to answer the question that I originally started with, let me just jump right over to it because we're short on time. The last few classes, I didn't have enough materials. This one, I went a little overboard. So I think this one. Yeah, let's go with this. Okay, the official reason for no longer practicing levirate marriage in the Talmud. Right, so why don't we? I mean, this is an explicit mitzvah. It seems bizarre that we wouldn't be following it. So in the Talmud in Brachot, the mitzvah of levirate marriage takes precedence over the mitzvah of chalitza. Chalitza is that ritual, that shaming ritual that I talked about, which dissolves the levirate marriage, as it is stated, and if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, right? Makes sense. The Mishnah adds, this was the case initially when people would intend that their performance of levirate marriage be for the sake of the mitzvah. But now that they do not intend that their performance of levirate marriage be for the sake of the mitzvah, but rather for reasons such as beauty of the yavama or financial gain, the sages said that the mitzvah of chalitza takes precedence over the mitzvah of levirate marriage. So this is a fascinating rabbinic loophole, or whatever terminology you want to use, of getting around an explicit mitzvah and saying basically that made sense at the time when people's motives were more pure. Now, we know at the time there were plenty of people whose motives were very impure. We have an entire Tanakh full of people who are sleeping with who knows who and worshiping who knows what kind of idols. So it's not the strongest argument, but there it is. More modern times. So we have, even before the modern state of Israel, and this is an issue that really needs to be amplified in our modern times when people are trying to delegitimize Israel. Many Jews were already living in Israel, and many others were moving to Israel, including from Yemen. Many of these Jews in Yemen had been, for the most part, cut off from the Jews of Europe and of many other parts of the world. And they had their practices that hadn't necessarily evolved. So in Europe, and there's another thing which, the three main cities of Torah learning in Europe all concluded that Yibum should not be prioritized, or they forbade it outright, this mitzvah, because of, in part, the fear of people, since there's also the prohibition against marrying your sister-in-law. But the Yemenites had no such thing. They kept doing it, right? They were also living in a Muslim society who were also doing it to a certain degree. So there was no problem. The Ashkenazim were living in a society where it was looked at as bizarre and incestuous. So that was another motivation for them not to do it. So anyway, so some of these Yemenites get to Israel. Rav Kook, who was the original chief rabbi, was confronted with this issue. What do we do, right? What we generally try not to do is if somebody has a custom, even if they come to a place that has a different custom, we generally don't like to mess with people's customs, especially with the fear of the slippery slope. You say, you don't do this one, you don't do that one. Well, then what's the point of all these customs anyway? I'm out of here, right? So we don't like to mess with people's customs. So he didn't really know what to do. And so it went back and forth, and if you follow this link, you can see that whole story. And I'll post this on Facebook or on the YouTube as well. And if anybody can't find those, just email me. So that was that story. And then in 1950, the Sephardic and Ashkenazic chief rabbis, Rabbi Tzien Uziel and Rabbi Yitzchak Herzog, made a number of takanot, enactments, to unify the Jewish people. They said, okay, all these varying minhagim, customs and all that, that's great, but this is getting out of hand. We need to have some things that are just, we're all on the same page on. One of them was accepting, reinforcing the cherem to Rabbeinu Gershon, particularly around polygamy. All right, so people coming from Arab countries, from Africa, who hadn't gotten the memo or who believed that the cherem to Rabbeinu Gershon expired, which it did, because it was a 1,000-year, it had an expiration date, said, okay, polygamy is okay. So they said, nope, it doesn't matter what the expiration date is, we're reenacting it. They also included in the Takanot an arrangement that all Jews would eschew Yibum in all circumstances, in other words, don't do it, and opt for Chalitza instead when relevant, God forbid. God forbid, because it's unfortunate when there's a widow. However, Chacham Ovadia Yosef was basically overruled it. Even though he wasn't the chief rabbi, he disagreed. He accepted the rulings of the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch that Yibum is preferred and to be encouraged. In 1951, at only the age 31, Rav Yosef, this is from a eulogy that was given for him, Rav Yosef courageously upheld Sephardic tradition and ruled that the Takana, the enactment of the chief rabbi, is invalid. Rav Yosef did not make this ruling in a vacuum. He issued it acting as the Dayan, the judge of the Beis Din of Petach Tikva, in an actual case. The Sephardic chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Rav Shalom Mesas, supported Rav Yosef's bold ruling and followed it in practice in actual Beis Din situations. Right? So even in 1951, this was still an issue. I don't know, I've never heard of, in my lifetime, I've never heard of somebody actually doing this. But if somebody is a follower of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and he had a big following, I was reading this eulogy, I think almost 1 million people or something came to his funeral, so that's not somebody to be taken lightly. He was saying that it still applies in modern times. All right, I think we'll end with that. The example from the book of Tobit that I talked about, I have in here as well. But that's that. And I know Dan wanted to play some stuff for those who have time as well, who might find those interesting, including seeing some of the Hebrew school families lighting the menorah, as well as Tamar Owens, who is a mother of Hebrew school children and on our board, making sufganiyot. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, Shikoa.